On the morning of May 10th, 1945, in a small village outside Munich, Germany, Sergeant James Mitchell of the United States Army stood in the doorway of what had once been a bakery. The spring sun filtered through broken windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny fragments of a world trying to rebuild itself. The smell of old flour still lingered in the abandoned space, mixing with the scent of wet earth from recent rain. James had been assigned to oversee the distribution of food supplies in this sector, a task that seemed simple compared to the months of conflict he had endured. He believed this would be routine work, perhaps even boring after everything he had witnessed. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What James did not know was that this quiet morning would introduce him to someone who would completely transform his understanding of humanity, compassion, and what it meant to truly see another person beyond the divisions that war had created. The village of Oberkirchen had been largely untouched by the final months of the conflict, though its people bore the marks of 6 years of hardship. James had arrived 3 days earlier with his unit, part of the occupation forces tasked with maintaining order and beginning the massive reconstruction effort. At 26 years old, he was older than many of the soldiers in his company, having worked as a school teacher in Philadelphia before being drafted in 1943. His background made him a natural choice for civilian liaison work, though nothing in his training had prepared him for the complexity of interacting with former enemies who were now simply hungry, exhausted people. The bakery had been recommended to James by Captain Robert Henderson, his commanding officer, as a potential distribution center. It was centrally located, had large work surfaces, and most importantly, it had been abandoned when the previous owners fled eastward in the final chaotic weeks before surrender. James walked through the main room, his boots crunching on scattered debris, taking mental notes about what repairs would be needed. The ovens were still intact, though cold and silent. Wooden shelves lined the walls, mostly empty now except for a few cracked bowls and rusted baking pans. As he turned to examine the storage room in the back, James heard a sound that made him freeze. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Someone was breathing, trying very hard to remain silent. His hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm, though he did not draw it. The conflict was over, but tensions remained high, and there had been reports of displaced persons hiding in abandoned buildings throughout the region. James called out in his carefully practiced German, his accent thick but comprehensible. He announced that he was with the American forces, and that whoever was there should show themselves. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from behind a large wooden cabinet in the corner. She was a woman, probably in her early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun and eyes that reflected both fear and determination. She wore a faded blue dress that had been mended multiple times, and her hands were rough and reddened from work. What struck James immediately was not her appearance, but the way she held herself, straight-backed despite obvious exhaustion, meeting his gaze directly even though her hands trembled slightly. Her name was Margaret Hoffman, and she had been the bakery's assistant before the previous owners departed. She explained in rapid German that she had nowhere else to go. Her home had been destroyed in a bombing raid 2 years earlier, and she had been living in the bakery's small upstairs apartment ever since, maintaining it in hopes that somehow someday it might reopen. She had not fled because she had no family remaining and nowhere to flee to. Her husband had been lost on the Eastern Front in 1943, and her parents had both passed away before the conflict began. James listened, understanding perhaps half of what she said, but grasping the essential meaning. He saw in her face the same exhaustion he had seen in countless others, civilians who had endured years of rationing, fear and loss, who now faced an uncertain future under occupation. But there was something else in Margaret's expression, something that gave him pause. It was not desperation exactly, but rather a kind of quiet resilience, as though she had decided that no matter what happened, she would face it with whatever dignity she could muster. The regulations were clear. Displaced persons were to be directed to the appropriate camps and processing centers. The building was now under military jurisdiction. James should have simply followed protocol, documented her presence, and arranged for her relocation. Instead, he found himself asking about the bakery, about how it had operated, about whether the equipment still worked. Margaret's face transformed when she spoke about baking. The fear receded, replaced by something approaching enthusiasm. She explained that she had been apprenticed to the bakery from age 14, learning every aspect of the trade. She knew these ovens intimately, understood the quirks of the ancient equipment, could judge dough consistency by touch alone. Before the conflict, this bakery had supplied bread to 3 neighboring villages, employing 5 people and producing hundreds of loaves daily. An idea began forming in James's mind, one that probably violated several regulations, but made practical sense. The occupation forces needed to establish food distribution quickly. A functioning bakery would be invaluable, and Margarete clearly knew how to run one. He told her to wait while he returned to headquarters to discuss the situation with Captain Henderson. The conversation with his commanding officer went better than expected. Henderson was a pragmatic man from Iowa, more interested in results than strict adherence to bureaucratic procedure. He had been a county administrator before the conflict and understood the value of utilizing local expertise. When James proposed employing Margaret to help establish the bakery as a distribution center, Henderson approved with only one condition. James would be personally responsible for supervising the operation and ensuring there were no security issues. Over the following weeks, James and Margaret worked together to restore the bakery to operation. The military provided flour, yeast, salt, and fuel. Margaret provided knowledge that could not be found in any manual. She showed James how to adjust the ancient oven's temperature by listening to the sound of the fire, how to knead dough for different types of bread, how to maximize efficiency in a workspace designed decades earlier. Their communication was a halting mixture of German and English, supplemented by gestures and demonstrations. James had studied German in school, but found that textbook phrases were useless for discussing fermentation times or oven temperatures. Margaret spoke no English initially, but proved to be a quick learner, picking up practical vocabulary with impressive speed. By the 3rd week, they had developed their own hybrid language, switching between tongues mid-sentence as needed. What surprised James most was Margaret's attitude toward him and the other American soldiers. There was no hostility, no resentment, despite everything her country and his had been through. She treated the work with complete professionalism, focusing on the task at hand rather than dwelling on the past. When James asked her about this one afternoon, as they waited for a batch of bread to finish baking, she gave him a long, thoughtful look before responding. She said that she had lost too much to carry hatred as well. Her husband was gone, her home was gone. 6 years of her life had been consumed by a conflict she had neither wanted nor understood. What remained was the simple reality of survival, of trying to build something useful from the ruins. The conflict had been waged by leaders and ideologies she had no control over. What mattered now was whether people could eat tomorrow. This conversation marked a shift in their relationship. They began talking about more than just work. During breaks, Margaret would describe what life in the village had been like before the conflict, the festivals, the harvests, the simple rhythms of a community that had existed for centuries. James shared stories about Philadelphia, about teaching history to skeptical teenagers, about his own family waiting for his return. He learned that Margaret had wanted to be a teacher herself, but that her family's economic situation had made it impossible. The bakery apprenticeship had been a practical choice, a way to learn a trade that would ensure stability. She had married at 22 to a quiet man named Franz, who had worked in his father's carpentry shop. They had been happy in an ordinary way, making plans for children and a small house they hoped to build. Then 1939 arrived and all such plans became impossibilities. James found himself looking forward to their conversations. Margaret had a way of describing things that made them vivid and real. She could talk about the texture of different grains or the color of sunrise over the village church with equal precision and interest. There was an intelligence in her observations that reminded him of his favorite students, the ones who asked questions that made him reconsider things he thought he understood. By June, the bakery was producing 200 loaves daily, distributed through a system that James and Margaret had designed together. Local residents received rations based on family size, with priority given to children and elderly persons. Margaret kept meticulous records, her handwriting precise and clear in the ledger James had provided. She also began training 2 other village women in the baking process, expanding capacity and providing employment to those who desperately needed it. Captain Henderson visited regularly and was consistently impressed by the operation's efficiency. During one inspection, he pulled James aside and remarked that this was exactly the kind of practical cooperation that would be essential for rebuilding. He also noted, with a knowing smile, that James seemed to have developed quite a working relationship with his German counterpart. James felt his face flush at the comment. He had been trying not to examine too closely what he felt when working with Margaret. It was professional respect, certainly, admiration for her skills and resilience, absolutely, but there was something more, something that made his chest tighten when she smiled at a successful batch of bread, something that made him find excuses to extend their working sessions. The realization that he was developing feelings for Margaret came gradually, then all at once. It happened on a warm evening in late June, as they cleaned the bakery after a particularly long day. The sun was setting, painting the workspace in golden light. Margaret was humming quietly as she wiped down the work surfaces, a melody James did not recognize but found beautiful. She had flour in her hair and on her cheek, and when she turned to ask him a question about the next day's schedule, James found himself unable to remember how to form words. She noticed his expression and asked if something was wrong. James shook his head, then decided that honesty was the only viable path forward. In his halting German, he told her that he thought she was remarkable, that working with her had become the best part of his days, that he looked forward to seeing her with an intensity that surprised him. Margaret's expression was unreadable for a long moment. Then, slowly, she set down the cloth she had been using and approached him. She said that she had been trying very hard not to feel what she felt, that it seemed impossible and inappropriate and complicated beyond measure. But the truth was that she had not felt this kind of connection to anyone since losing Franz, and even that had been different, something built over years of shared history rather than forged in the intensity of these strange circumstances. They stood facing each other in the fading light, both acutely aware of the impossibility of their situation. James was an occupying soldier, representing the forces that had defeated her country. Margaret was a German civilian, technically under his authority in this working arrangement. Any relationship between them would be viewed with suspicion by both sides, subject to regulations and social stigma that could make their lives extremely difficult. James suggested that perhaps they should maintain professional distance for both their sakes. Margaret agreed that this was probably wise. They returned to cleaning in silence, carefully avoiding eye contact, both acutely miserable. This resolution lasted approximately 4 days. On the 5th day, as they worked side by side kneading dough, their hands touched accidentally. Neither pulled away. They looked at each other, and something in that shared glance dissolved all the careful resolutions they had made. James asked if she would walk with him after work, somewhere away from the bakery and the village, where they could talk freely. Margaret said yes. They began meeting in the evenings, walking along the roads outside the village, talking about everything and nothing. James discovered that Margaret had a sharp sense of humor, often making observations about village personalities that left him laughing despite himself. She learned that beneath his serious exterior, James was deeply idealistic, someone who genuinely believed in education and human potential, who had been profoundly shaken by what he had witnessed during the conflict, but remained determined to work towards something better. These walks became the foundation of their relationship. Away from the bakery and the military presence, they could simply be 2 people trying to understand each other across the vast gulf of their different experiences. Margaret described growing up in a small farming community, the poverty and limited opportunities that had shaped her early life. James talked about American cities, about diversity and possibility, but also about prejudice and inequality that contradicted his country's stated ideals. They discussed the conflict itself, carefully at first, then with increasing openness. Margaret had never supported the regime that had led her country to ruin, but she acknowledged the complexity of living under such a system, the way ordinary people convinced themselves that things were not as bad as they seemed, or that they were powerless to change anything. James admitted his own nation's failings, the way his country had turned away refugees, the persistent racism that made his society far less perfect than its propaganda suggested. What emerged from these conversations was a shared understanding that war created victims on all sides, that ideology and nationalism destroyed nuance, that individual human beings were infinitely more complex than any political system could accommodate. They found in each other a kind of recognition, a sense that despite all their differences, they saw the world in fundamentally similar ways. By August, their relationship had become common knowledge in the village. Reactions were mixed. Some villagers viewed Margaret with suspicion, seeing her closeness to an American soldier as collaboration or betrayal. Others understood that she was simply trying to survive and perhaps find some happiness after years of loss. Among James's fellow soldiers, responses ranged from good-natured teasing to more serious concerns about fraternization regulations. Captain Henderson called James into his office for a formal conversation about the situation. He explained that while relationships between occupation forces and German civilians were not explicitly forbidden, they were strongly discouraged and could create complications. He asked James directly about his intentions. James responded honestly. He said that he had developed deep feelings for Margaret, that he believed she felt the same, that he was considering the possibility of a future together once his service ended. He acknowledged the complications, but argued that the entire premise of the occupation was to build bridges between former enemies, to create conditions for lasting peace. How could that happen if individual human connections were forbidden? Henderson listened, then leaned back in his chair with a sigh. He said that officially, he was required to discourage such relationships. Unofficially, he had seen how James and Margaret had built something genuinely useful in the bakery, had created an operation that served the community effectively. He had also observed that their relationship seemed to be based on genuine mutual respect and affection. He would not interfere, but he advised James to be prepared for difficulties ahead, both bureaucratic and social. This conversation emboldened James to think seriously about the future. His service commitment would end in approximately 6 months. He could return to Philadelphia, resume his teaching career, and try to forget about this complicated German woman who had somehow become essential to his happiness. Or he could pursue something far more difficult, bringing Margaret to America as his wife. The legal and logistical challenges were substantial. Marriage between American servicemen and German civilians required extensive paperwork and approval from multiple levels of command. There were background checks, interviews, waiting periods. The process could take months or even years, with no guarantee of success. And even if they managed to navigate the bureaucracy, they would face social challenges in America, where anti-German sentiment remained strong. James discussed all of this with Margaret during one of their evening walks, on a path that wound through fields recovering from years of neglect. The summer evening was warm, with swallows diving through the air catching insects. They stopped near an old stone wall where Margaret sat down, her expression thoughtful, as James outlined the complexities they would face. He wanted to be completely honest about what pursuing a relationship would mean, the obstacles they would face, the possibility that it might all prove impossible. He explained the American immigration system, the background checks that could disqualify her for reasons neither of them could predict, the medical examinations that were invasive and humiliating. He described the social challenges they would face in Philadelphia, where his neighbors would judge them, where her accent would mark her as other, where finding work might be nearly impossible. He talked about his own family, who would struggle to accept a German daughter-in-law. His father had lost a brother in the conflict, killed during the push through France. His mother had spent years volunteering with organizations supporting the effort against Germany. They were good people, James insisted, but they had been shaped by years of propaganda and genuine loss. Acceptance would not come easily. James also acknowledged his own uncertainties. He had been a teacher before the conflict, but returning to that profession after everything he had witnessed would be challenging. He was not sure he could stand in front of a classroom and pretend that the world made sense, that there were clear answers to complex questions. He might struggle to find his place in civilian life, and she would be navigating those struggles alongside him while also managing her own adaptation. Would she be willing to face all of this, he asked, for a future that was uncertain at best? Would she leave her homeland, her language, everything familiar, to build a life in a country where she would always be marked as foreign? He would understand completely if she said no, if she chose the difficult but known challenges of rebuilding in Germany over the unknown difficulties of America. Margarete listened to his careful explanation without interruption, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. When he finally fell silent, waiting for her response, she remained quiet for a long moment. A breeze rustled through the wheat growing in the nearby field, carrying the scent of summer earth. Then she smiled in a way that made his heart ache, a smile that contained both sadness and hope. She said that she had already lost one life, the one she had planned with Franz before the conflict consumed everything. They had imagined a simple future, children, a small house, Sunday dinners with extended family, the steady rhythms of a community that had existed for generations. That future had died when Franz failed to return from the east, and it had been buried completely when her home was destroyed in the bombing raid. She had spent 2 years living in the ruins of that lost future, she continued, going through motions without hope or direction. She woke each morning, worked when there was work available, slept each night and felt nothing. The world had become grey and flat, devoid of meaning or possibility. She had not actively wanted to die, but she had not particularly wanted to live either. She had simply existed, moving through days that blurred together into meaningless repetition. Meeting James had awakened something she thought had died with her husband, the possibility of genuine connection, of building something new rather than merely surviving. She had not expected it, had actively resisted it at first, had tried to convince herself that what she felt was gratitude or loneliness rather than authentic affection. But honesty forced her to acknowledge that this was real, that James had somehow become essential to her in ways she had not thought possible again. She was not naive about the challenges, she continued, her voice steady. She knew that moving to America would mean leaving everything familiar, learning a new language properly, beyond the basic phrases she had acquired, adapting to a completely different culture, whose unwritten rules she did not understand. She knew that people would judge them, that some would see her as the enemy regardless of individual circumstances. She knew that she might always feel slightly displaced, never fully German anymore, but never fully American either. But she also knew that the alternative, watching James leave while she remained in Oberkirchen alone, returning to that grey existence of mere survival, was unbearable. She had been given an unexpected second chance at a meaningful life, and she would be a fool to reject it, because the path forward was difficult. All paths were difficult now. At least this one led towards something worth reaching for. She asked James if he had considered what it would mean for him to marry a German woman. He would face criticism from friends and family. His career might be affected. People who did not know them would make assumptions about their relationship, about his character, about her motivations. He would be tied to someone who would always be marked as foreign, whose past would be scrutinized, whose loyalties would be questioned. Was he truly ready for that? James reached for her hand, feeling the rough texture of her work-worn skin against his palm. He said that he had thought of little else for weeks. Yes, it would be difficult. Yes, there would be judgment and obstacles. But he had spent months in Germany witnessing destruction and suffering, seeing what hatred and division created. He had come to understand that the conflict had not been fought between nations of faceless enemies, but between individual human beings who were all capable of both terrible and noble actions. Meeting Margarete had crystallized something he had been struggling to articulate, that genuine peace could not be built through political agreements alone, but required individual human connections, required people to see beyond nationality and history, to recognize shared humanity. Their relationship was a small act of that recognition, a refusal to let the past determine the future. He could return to Philadelphia alone, resume his previous life, find someone whose background would not complicate things. It would be easier in many ways, but it would also feel like a betrayal of everything he had come to believe, a retreat into the same tribalism that had made the conflict possible. He wanted more than that. He wanted to build something better, even if it was difficult, even if it was just one small partnership in a world that desperately needed more such connections. They sat together on the stone wall as the sun set, watching the sky transform through shades of orange and purple and deep blue. Neither spoke, but their joined hands communicated what words could not fully express: commitment to try, willingness to face whatever challenges emerged, determination to build something lasting from the ruins of the past. They decided to pursue the marriage application process, fully aware that it might not succeed, but willing to try. James began gathering the necessary documents and working through the bureaucratic requirements. Margaret obtained her own papers, including certifications that she had no affiliation with prohibited organizations, that her background was clear of any concerning activities. The next 4 months tested their commitment in ways neither had anticipated. The application process was slow and frustrating, with each step seeming to reveal new requirements and complications. There were interviews where officials asked probing questions about their relationship, clearly skeptical that genuine affection could exist between former enemies. There were medical examinations, background investigations, character references that had to be obtained from multiple sources. Through it all, they continued working together at the bakery, maintaining the operation they had built, while navigating the complex process of trying to build a life together. The work became a kind of anchor, a reminder that they could create something functional and good despite all obstacles. In November, they received preliminary approval for the marriage, contingent on final clearances that were expected to take several more weeks. James proposed formally on a cold evening, presenting Margaret with a simple ring he had purchased from a jeweler in Munich. She accepted, and they celebrated quietly, knowing that significant hurdles still remained. The final approval came through in mid-December, just weeks before James's scheduled departure for America. They were married in a simple civil ceremony, with Captain Henderson serving as witness, and a handful of friends from both the American forces and the village attending. There was no elaborate celebration, no traditional wedding feast. Instead, they had a small gathering at the bakery, sharing bread and modest refreshments with those who had supported them. The journey to America was long and complicated, involving multiple stages of travel and processing. They departed from Bremen in early January 1946, aboard a military transport ship carrying returning servicemen and a small number of war brides. The crossing took 9 days, through rough winter seas that left Margaret miserably seasick for much of the journey. James stayed with her throughout, holding her hand through the worst of the seasickness, describing what awaited them in Philadelphia, trying to make the unknown future seem less daunting. Margaret listened to his descriptions of American life with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, asking detailed questions about everything from weather patterns to grocery shopping procedures. They arrived in New York Harbor on a gray morning, the Statue of Liberty emerging from the mist like a promise, or perhaps a challenge. Margaret stood at the railing, seeing America for the first time, and James watched her face, trying to imagine what she must be feeling. Everything familiar was now behind her. Everything ahead was unknown. The processing at Ellis Island took hours, with officials examining every document, asking questions, verifying identities. Margaret's German accent drew suspicious looks from some officials, though her papers were in order, and her status as a war bride was clearly documented. James stayed close, ready to intervene if any problems arose, but the process concluded without incident. From New York, they traveled by train to Philadelphia, a journey that allowed Margaret her first real views of the American landscape. She was fascinated by the size of everything: the vast farms, the sprawling cities, the abundance visible even in winter. James had tried to describe American prosperity, but seeing it firsthand was different. She understood for the first time the vast disparity between American and German resources, why the outcome of the conflict had never really been in doubt once America fully committed. James's family met them at the Philadelphia train station. His parents, Joseph and Martha Mitchell, were polite but clearly uncertain about this German daughter-in-law. His younger sister, Ruth, was more openly curious, asking Margaret direct questions about Germany and what it had been like during the conflict. The initial meeting was awkward, with everyone trying too hard to be welcoming while simultaneously processing the strangeness of the situation. The first months in Philadelphia were difficult for Margarete. Her English, while improving, was still limited, making everyday interactions challenging. The abundance of goods in American stores was overwhelming after years of severe rationing. The casual friendliness of strangers felt confusing to someone accustomed to more reserved German social norms. She felt constantly off balance, trying to navigate a culture whose unwritten rules she did not understand. James had resumed his teaching position, which meant Margaret spent long hours alone in their small apartment. She tried to find work, but discovered that her bakery skills were not easily transferable without better English and local credentials. Some potential employers were openly hostile when they detected her accent, making clear that they would not hire a German regardless of qualifications. There were moments when Margaret wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, if the connection she and James had built in the specific circumstances of post-conflict Germany could survive transplantation to this utterly foreign environment. She missed simple things, the German language flowing naturally from her mouth, the familiar landscape of her village, the work she had known so well at the bakery. James sensed her struggle and tried to help, but he was navigating his own readjustment. Returning to civilian life after years of military service was harder than he had anticipated. The classroom felt simultaneously familiar and strange. His students seemed impossibly young and naive, unaware of the world beyond their immediate experience. He found himself impatient with trivial complaints, unable to relate to concerns about grades and social dynamics when he had so recently witnessed genuine suffering. What saved them, ultimately, was their commitment to being completely honest with each other about their struggles. They had built their relationship on direct communication during those months in Oberkirchen, and they maintained that foundation even when conversations were painful and difficult. One evening in late March, after a particularly hard day for both of them, they sat at their small kitchen table and talked for hours about whether they had made a mistake, whether their relationship could survive these challenges. Margaret admitted her loneliness and profound disorientation. She described feeling like she was drowning in a language she could not fully speak, in a culture whose logic escaped her. She talked about the humiliation of being treated as less intelligent because her English was imperfect, about the isolation of spending days alone with only her inadequate words for company. She confessed that some mornings she woke and could not remember why she had thought coming to America was a good idea, could not recall what had made the difficulties seem worthwhile. James acknowledged his own struggles with readjustment and his deep fear that he had asked too much of her by bringing her to America. He had been so focused on the bureaucratic challenges of getting approval for their marriage that he had not fully considered what came after, had not adequately prepared either of them for the social and emotional difficulties they would face. He felt he had failed her, had promised implicitly that things would be difficult but manageable, when in reality they were proving nearly overwhelming. They cried together that night, releasing accumulated frustration and fear and doubt. But in that vulnerability, they also rediscovered what had drawn them together initially, the ability to be completely honest with each other, to share struggles without pretense or defensiveness. They had both lost so much during the conflict years. They had both learned that survival sometimes meant simply enduring what could not be changed, but they had also learned that genuine human connection was rare and precious, worth fighting for even when the fight was exhausting. From that conversation emerged a new determination. They would stop trying to make everything work perfectly and instead focus on building small, sustainable routines. Margaret would stop pressuring herself to integrate completely into American culture and instead find ways to maintain connection with her German identity while gradually adapting to her new environment. James would seek out other veterans who might understand his readjustment struggles rather than trying to pretend he was seamlessly resuming his pre-conflict life. Together, they developed concrete strategies for managing the transition. Margaret enrolled in English classes specifically designed for immigrants, held at a community center 3 evenings per week. The classes were taught by a woman named Dorothy Chen, herself an immigrant from China, who understood intimately the challenges of learning a new language while navigating cultural displacement. In Dorothy's classroom, Margaret met other women facing similar struggles. A Polish woman named Katarzyna, who had survived terrible experiences during the conflict. An Italian woman named Lucia, whose husband had been an American soldier she married in Rome. A Hungarian woman named Esther, who spoke 6 languages but still struggled with English idioms. These women became Margaret's first real friends in America. They understood without extensive explanation what it meant to feel perpetually foreign, to constantly translate thoughts before speaking, to miss home while knowing that home no longer existed in the form they remembered. They shared strategies for managing difficult situations, warned each other about which shopkeepers were hostile to immigrants, celebrated small victories like successfully making a telephone call or understanding a joke on the radio. The friendships that formed in Dorothy's classroom extended beyond class time. The women began meeting for coffee, sharing meals, helping each other navigate the American systems for healthcare, employment, housing. Margaret discovered that she could help others as well, that her experience with bureaucracy and paperwork in Germany made her adept at understanding the forms and requirements that seemed designed to confuse immigrants. She helped Katarzyna fill out citizenship applications, assisted Lucia in finding childcare, taught Esther how American bakeries operated when Esther expressed interest in finding work in that field. Through these friendships, Margaret's English improved dramatically. More importantly, her confidence grew. She began to understand that her struggles were not personal failures, but common experiences among immigrants. The isolation that had felt so crushing began to lift as she built a community of women who shared similar challenges and could offer both practical assistance and emotional support. Meanwhile, James joined a veterans group that met weekly at a church basement in their neighborhood. The group was facilitated by a chaplain named Father Michael O'Brien, who had served with American forces in the Pacific Theater and understood the complex process of returning to civilian life. The men who attended the group sessions came from various backgrounds and had served in different locations, but they shared common experiences of readjustment difficulty. In these meetings, James could talk about things he could not discuss elsewhere, the nightmares that still woke him, the difficulty of relating to people who had not witnessed what he had witnessed, the strange guilt of having survived when others had not. He could admit that teaching high school sometimes felt absurd, that listening to teenagers complain about homework seemed trivial when he remembered the devastation he had seen in Germany. He also talked about Margaret, about the complexity of loving someone from the former enemy nation, about the social challenges their marriage created. Some group members were supportive, sharing their own experiences with unusual relationships or family members who had married foreigners. Others were more skeptical, though they expressed their doubts respectfully, acknowledging that James's situation was his own to navigate. Through the veterans group, James connected with other men working in education, who were also struggling to resume teaching after military service. They formed an informal support network, meeting occasionally for dinner to discuss classroom challenges and share strategies for making education relevant to students who had no direct experience of the conflict that had so shaped their teachers' worldviews. James also became involved in education programs focused on international understanding, using his experience in occupied Germany to advocate for more nuanced approaches to former enemy nations. He gave presentations at schools and community centers, describing the German civilians he had met, challenging simplistic narratives about entire populations being uniformly evil or guilty. These presentations sometimes generated controversy, with audience members questioning whether it was appropriate to humanize Germans so soon after the conflict ended. But James persisted, believing deeply that lasting peace required Americans to understand Germans as complex individuals rather than faceless enemies. Through both Margaret's English classes and James's veterans group and educational work, they gradually built networks of support that made their daily lives more manageable. They were no longer facing their challenges in complete isolation. They had people who understood, who could offer practical help and emotional encouragement, who validated that their struggles were real but not insurmountable. By their first anniversary in July 1947, their life had achieved a kind of stability, though it remained far from easy. Margaret's English had improved to the point where she could hold extended conversations, though she still struggled with idioms and rapid speech. She had begun volunteering at the community center, where she attended classes, helping to organize food distribution programs for newly arrived immigrants. This volunteer work drew on her experience from the Obese bakery, giving her a sense of purpose and a way to contribute that did not require perfect English. James had found his rhythm in the classroom again, though he taught differently now than before the conflict. He incorporated more discussion of international relations and the human costs of political decisions, pushing his students to think critically about what they read in newspapers and heard on the radio. Some parents complained that he was making history too political, but his principal supported him, recognizing that students needed to develop sophisticated thinking about complex global issues. They still faced occasional hostility from those who could not accept their relationship. A neighbor 3 doors down refused to speak to Margaret, turning away whenever they encountered each other. Some of James's extended family members had stopped inviting them to gatherings, but they also found acceptance in unexpected places. The elderly Jewish couple who lived upstairs and appreciated Margaret's determination to build a new life in a foreign land. The Irish shopkeeper, who treated Margaret with kindness because his own parents had faced discrimination as immigrants. The African-American teacher at James's school, who understood intimately what it meant to be judged based on category rather than individual character. In October, Margaret received a letter from Germany, forwarded through several addresses before finally reaching her. It was from Frau Schmidt, one of the elderly women she had trained at the Obese bakery. The letter brought news from the village, who had returned from detention camps, who had not returned at all, how the community was slowly rebuilding. Frau Schmidt wrote that the bakery was operating again under new ownership and that they still used some of the techniques Margaret had taught them. She hoped Margaret was well in America and asked her to write back if she was willing to maintain contact. Margaret spent an entire evening composing her response, struggling to find words in German that could convey the complexity of her experience in America. She described Philadelphia, her English classes, the volunteer work, the challenges and small triumphs. She wrote about James, about their marriage, trying to explain to someone who had known her in Oberkirchen how this unlikely relationship had developed and what it meant to her. Writing in German after months of struggling with English felt like returning to herself, and she found herself filling pages with thoughts and observations she had been unable to express in her adopted language. The act of writing to someone from her former life helped Margaret understand how much she had changed in less than 2 years. She was no longer simply the German baker who had lost everything in the conflict. She was becoming something new, an immigrant, a wife in a cross-cultural marriage, a volunteer helping other displaced persons, someone building a life between two worlds. The transformation was not complete and might never be, but she could see its outlines forming. James watched her write the letter, seeing how the act of using her native language seemed to relax something in her that had been tense since their arrival in America. He suggested that perhaps they should establish regular times when they spoke only German at home, allowing Margaret to maintain fluency and giving him practice with a language he wanted to understand better. This became another small ritual that helped bridge their different backgrounds. Evenings when German was the household language, when Margaret could speak without translating, when James could practice the language of her homeland. In November, Margaret achieved another significant milestone. She successfully completed a job interview in English and was hired to work part-time at a small neighborhood bakery run by an Austrian immigrant named Wilhelm Hartmann. Wilhelm had left Austria in the 1930s, fleeing political developments he had found intolerable, and had built a modest but respected business serving European-style breads and pastries to Philadelphia's immigrant communities. Wilhelm had been skeptical about hiring Margaret initially, concerned that her German accent might alienate customers in the post-conflict climate. But when she demonstrated her skills, kneading dough with practiced efficiency, judging oven temperatures precisely, producing loaves that had the substance and character his customers expected, he recognized her expertise. He offered her 20 hours per week at modest wages, with the possibility of more hours if the arrangement worked well. In 1948, Margaret became a naturalized American citizen. James accompanied her to the ceremony, watching as she took the oath of allegiance alongside dozens of other immigrants from around the world. When she emerged with her citizenship certificate, there were tears in her eyes, though whether from joy or the complexity of the moment, James could not say. She had not renounced her German identity so much as added an American one, becoming someone who belonged to both worlds and fully to neither. That same year, Margaret achieved another milestone. She opened a small bakery in their neighborhood, using savings they had carefully accumulated. It was tiny compared to the operation in Oberkirchen, just enough space for 2 ovens and a small retail area. But it was hers, a place where she could use the skills she had spent years developing. The bakery became a modest success, serving the local community with bread and pastries that blended German traditions with American tastes. Margaret had a gift for adaptation, understanding what customers wanted while maintaining the quality and techniques she had learned in her apprenticeship. She hired other immigrant women, creating employment for those struggling to find their place in their new country. James continued teaching, eventually becoming department chair at his school. He used his position to develop curriculum that emphasized critical thinking about international relations and the human costs of conflict. His students did not always understand why Mr. Mitchell was so insistent that they consider multiple perspectives, but some would later credit him with expanding their worldview at a crucial age. In 1951, Margaret gave birth to their daughter, Anna. The pregnancy had been unexpected. Both had assumed that at their ages parenthood was unlikely, but Anna arrived healthy and determined, instantly becoming the center of their world. James, who had spent years teaching other people's children, discovered that having his own was entirely different and far more terrifying. Margaret proved to be a natural mother, patient and practical. She raised Anna to speak both English and German, insisting that her daughter should be fluent in both languages. She told Anna stories about Germany, about the village and the bakery, about the importance of understanding where one came from. But she also emphasized that Anna was American, that this was her country and her future. As the years passed, James and Margaret watched as attitudes toward Germany gradually shifted. The former enemy became an ally, essential to American strategy in the developing Cold War. Former soldiers who had fought against Germany now spoke of the need to support German recovery. It was disorienting to witness such rapid transformation of public opinion, though neither James nor Margarete commented much on it publicly. In their private conversations, they sometimes discussed the irony of it all, how quickly enemies could become friends when strategic interests aligned, how readily people forgot past conflicts when new ones emerged. But they also acknowledged that this shifting perspective made their own lives easier, reduced the social stigma they had initially faced. By 1960, Margaret's bakery had expanded to include a small cafe, employing 8 people and serving as a neighborhood gathering place. It was not what she had imagined when she first learned the trade as a 14-year-old girl in Bavaria, but it was satisfying in ways she had not anticipated. She had built something lasting, created employment, fed her community. In its own small way, it was a form of reconstruction. James retired from teaching in 1968, after 25 years in the classroom. His retirement dinner was attended by dozens of former students, many of whom spoke about how his teaching had influenced their thinking about the world. Several mentioned that Mr. Mitchell had been the first person to make them understand that history was not just dates and battles, but human beings making choices under difficult circumstances. In their later years, James and Margaret became increasingly involved in programs promoting international understanding and reconciliation. They spoke at schools and community centers about their experience, offering a personal counter-narrative to simplified stories about the conflict and its aftermath. They emphasized that peace was built not through grand political gestures alone, but through individual human connections, through the hard work of seeing beyond categories to recognize shared humanity. Anna grew up to become a translator, working primarily with German and English texts. She attributed her career choice to growing up in a bilingual household, to understanding from an early age that different languages represented different ways of seeing the world. She married a man whose parents had emigrated from Italy, creating a family that embodied the immigrant experience that had built America. In 1990, as Germany reunified and the Cold War ended, James and Margaret made their first trip back to Oberkirchen together. It was Margaret's first return since leaving 44 years earlier. The village had changed substantially, though the bakery building still stood. It had gone through several owners over the decades and was currently operating as a cafe and pastry shop. The current owner, learning of Margaret's history with the building, invited them in and gave them a tour. Margaret walked through the familiar space, now modernized but still recognizable, touching the walls and surfaces she had known so well. She told stories about working there, about meeting James, about the strange circumstances that had brought them together. The owner listened with fascination, then insisted they stay for coffee and pastries. As they sat in the cafe, surrounded by customers who had no idea of the history these two elderly Americans represented, James reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. She smiled at him, the same smile that had made him forget how to form words all those years ago in the sunset-lit bakery. They had built a good life against considerable odds. It had required work and compromise and constant effort to bridge the gaps between their different backgrounds. But they had succeeded in creating something that transcended the divisions of nationality and history, a genuine partnership, a family, a shared life that honored both their pasts while building something new. When they returned to Philadelphia, they carried with them photographs of the old bakery and renewed connections with some of Oberkirchen's current residents. Margaret seemed lighter somehow, as though returning had resolved some long-held tension, had allowed her to integrate the different parts of her life into a coherent whole. James passed away in 1995, at the age of 76, from complications related to heart disease. In his final days, surrounded by family, he spoke often of the bakery in Oberkirchen, of the woman he had met there who had changed his entire understanding of what was possible. He told Anna that meeting her mother had been the most important moment of his life, that everything good that followed had stemmed from that encounter. Margaret lived another 7 years, remaining active in the bakery until shortly before her death. She passed away in 2002 at the age of 89, surrounded by children and grandchildren who represented the fruit of that unlikely connection forged in the ruins of post-conflict Germany. At her funeral, Anna spoke about her mother's remarkable journey, from a small Bavarian village to Philadelphia, from assistant baker to business owner, from widow grieving in the ruins to woman who built a new life in a foreign land. She emphasized that her mother's story was not unique. Thousands of women had made similar journeys as war brides, adapting to new countries and cultures with courage and determination. But what made Margaret's story particularly meaningful, Anna continued, was what it represented about human possibility. In the midst of history's most destructive conflict, in circumstances that seemed designed to make connection impossible, two people from opposing sides had recognized their common humanity. They had built a relationship based on mutual respect, had created a family that bridged former enemy nations, had lived lives that demonstrated the possibility of reconciliation and understanding. The bakery Margaret founded continued operating under Anna's management for several more years before being sold to a young entrepreneur who maintained its character while updating operations. Their small plaque installed near the entrance commemorated Margaret's role in founding the business, noting that she had brought traditional German baking techniques to the neighborhood and had created a gathering place that served the community for over 5 decades. The story of James and Margaret might seem like a small footnote to the massive historical events of the mid-20th century. They were not famous figures, did not shape policy or lead movements. They were simply two ordinary people who met in extraordinary circumstances and chose to build something together, despite all obstacles. But perhaps that is exactly what makes their story significant. History is not made only by leaders and generals, by grand strategies and political agreements. It is also made by individual choices, by the daily decisions of ordinary people to reach across divides, to recognize humanity in the supposed enemy, to build connections rather than walls. The bakery in Oberkirchen, where they met, still stands, now serving a new generation of customers. The building in Philadelphia that housed Margaret's bakery has been converted to other uses. Though long-time neighborhood residents still remember the woman with the German accent who made extraordinary bread and pastries. These physical places persist as quiet monuments to what was built there, not just in terms of businesses, but in terms of human connection. In the end, what James and Margaret demonstrated was something both simple and profound, that even in the aftermath of terrible conflict, people can choose understanding over hatred, connection over division, hope over despair. They showed that nationality and history need not determine individual destiny, that people can write their own stories even when larger forces seem to have already written the ending. Their daughter Anna, now elderly herself, sometimes tells her own grandchildren about their great-grandparents, about the American soldier and the German baker who met in a ruined village and built a life together. She emphasizes that it was not easy, that there were struggles and obstacles and moments of doubt, but they persisted, and in persisting they created something beautiful and lasting. This is perhaps the most important lesson of their story, that building peace is not an abstract political process, but a human one, requiring patience and effort, and the willingness to see beyond categories to the individual person standing before you. James and Margaret lived that lesson, and in doing so they contributed in their own small way to healing the wounds that conflict had created. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.